love at this point to open it up to any questions, and we'll make this a dialogue. You can feel free to ask a question and get a response and then ask a follow-up question. But before we do that, I just want to comment briefly on healthcare, because it's interesting that all four of you said you'd like a greater focus on the economy, and yet the president's argument coming out of the gate was that solving the healthcare crisis in his mind would only be possible if we first reformed our healthcare system. Now, perhaps because the intensity of that reform was not so great and it was not ultimately comprehensive, the economic stimulus and impact that he envisioned for such legislation to have just did not constitute what would be the kind of economic change that would help everyday people at everyday times. But I just thought it was interesting and important to mention that. And then the last thing that I encourage you to think about, and the panelists and any questions that you have may inform a lively discussion on this topic. But a couple of you mentioned super PACs or the impact of money, and from my travels to date, I've seen young people concerned that there's a two-party monolithic structure that basically is hijacked by corporate interests, but it's not really just the Democrats or Republicans who have succumbed to this being the prisoner of major corporations. It's every political person who succeeds and wins an election has to be at the beck and call of rather than a constituency or his own or her own integrity, a world of donors and political action committees and celebrities, or whether it's the brothers, the corporate brothers who back the Romney campaign, or any number of industries, trial lawyers who favor the Democrats. It seems like there may be a grassroots campaign that young people will lead into the future that doesn't have a party tinge or affiliation, and will simply be how we can recover our democracy. And I don't know if you folks were involved in the Howard Dean campaign, but his campaign seemed to be very focused on change in terms of our democratic structure, and maybe even more so than what was the Democratic primary and ultimately the general election campaign of President Obama. But having said that, I wonder if any of your questions might relate to how you can correct the money problem, or the unlimited donations that fuel our political system. But I think we're ready for any questions. I think the mic needs to be turned on, so the first person who may have a question, if they could just turn it on from the bottom of the mic. Someone must have a thought. It could be a thought that might generate some conversation. Thank you. Right in the very bottom, there's the other side. If you look toward the other side, you don't actually have to take it out. Okay, we're gonna get some. No, that's fine. It's right there. Got it?
Hello, sorry. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a political science student, and I'm also a journalist for the newspaper here on campus. And I know this is a little off topic to what you were leaning towards, but it was something that I had in mind sitting here. A lot of you guys made arguments in favor of President Obama, and although I openly support your choice, and I know a lot of students on campus do, what, if any, argument could you make in favor of the Romney campaign, given the fact that there are a small population of students that do support him, and there are some things that he is in favor of that in some way, shape, or form might benefit the people more than any thing that President Obama is proposing? So what argument could you possibly make in proponent of the governor?
Well, I'd like to start off with, I think the Romney-Ryan campaign has definitely hit on the fact that we do need to reform entitlements. Whatever, some people get offended by calling them entitlements, but social welfare programs, if only because we have a huge bulge in the population who is about to start consuming vast amounts of resources, and we presently don't even have the funding levels from the federal government to sustain that. So we do need to have a discussion about where we're going to get the money for Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid and many other social welfare programs that constitute the United States safety net. I do think those programs are essential to sustain a standard of living which we have become accustomed to and we believe is essential, to have in our country. So I think that's one case, or that's one argument in favor of the Romney-Ryan ticket, is that they're actually focusing on kind of fixing the big gaping hole in the federal budget.
I would argue that a Romney presidency would bring bipartisanship to the front. If we go off on the president or Governor Romney's record as Massachusetts governor, I would be encouraged. I think that he would continue healthcare reform. I think he would generally stay away from social issues and he would focus on economic reforms. And I think that is a very strong factor. And that is something important for a potential voter to consider in favor of President Romney.
I think he's very good at what he does, and that's running a business. He's a businessman, and he's great at that. But a president needs to be more than just a businessman. Sure, you can see the country as a business, but you need to see it as more than just a business. For businesses, you could always say, you know what, didn't work out, file for bankruptcy, start over somewhere else, start with something new. But you can't do that as a president. You can't just give up and move on. You need to be more. It's not something he has at the moment.
I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but I thought those were very
Yes.
interesting answers and highlight, in your case, one of the central issues that, in terms of the interests of young voters and are you voting against your interests or for your interests? But I thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ian. I have a basic question. So there have been a lot of lies coming out of the Romney Paul campaign. I was just wondering, it kind of becomes an issue of free speech. Should they be allowed to lie to Americans? It's arguable whether they're knowingly doing it or not, but possibly knowingly. What do you guys think about that?
I think that each candidate sort of has a vision of what they feel that would be sort of fulfilling for the United States. And so I don't know, I mean, like you mentioned, they're not knowingly lying, but they sort of do exaggerate or do make promises that they're not necessarily intending to fulfill. So I think that sort of it falls based on whatever their perspective is or their opinion is about what the country should look like.
I wonder too, and I don't know if this is an undertone of your question, but beyond exaggerating and I think both campaigns are guilty of that, just taking words out of context, it's become important for these truth squads amongst journalists to be assembled for the debates and for any television advertisement. But I wonder too, and I wonder if you could elaborate on this, do you think there's any racial demagoguery that you've seen coming out of the Romney-Ryan ticket, or do you believe that their efforts to galvanize the white base that supports the Republican Party, whether it's evangelical or not, do you think that that's a separate and perhaps an inaccurate way of reading it?
I think when they do skew things that way, they are playing to that base. But it's just, to me, it's just an issue of just outright lies, not even their vision, which of course there's going to be bias, but just not checking facts.
Right, the one outright lie that nonpartisan fact checkers and Democrats have accused the Romney-Ryan campaign of making is this fact, or not fact, it's not a fact, that the president supported terminating the work requirement. That's been the most highlighted example. is there a racial component of that? You know, we Romney, and I'm just hypothetically, we Romney supporters, you know, we work, and the president is a man of color. Do you buy into that, or do you think that they're playing honest by at least the values that we all subscribe to? It's just that they've got the wrong hand in terms of being dealt misinformation. The Republicans, that is.
I'm kind of confused by the question.
Do you think that the lies are not that lies can be informed, let me use a different word. Do you think the lies are guided by an effort to stack one, you know, racial group of this country up against another? Do you think there's a racial motivation or impetus to engage in that lie or wider lies that you might accuse the Romney campaign of making?
I think there is a percentage of the population that does want to sort of go against or be on the side in that sense. But I think that's almost beside the fact when you start to get into issues of like, are candidates telling the truth? I mean, that's the big thing for me.
Yeah, and I'd raise it to all of you if you thought that there was any racist or racial element in terms of Republican attacks. I know in the HBO documentary Game Change, the writers consulting Mark Halperin's book on the topic, which was very comprehensive documentation of the 2008 campaign, they make clear in that book, Game Change, as well as in the HBO documentary, that McCain ultimately, after the Reverend Wright saga ended, did not want to infuse any of the negativity he was putting forth with anything that could be considered racial code. That was one area where McCain, according to campaign advisor Steve Schmidt, who was running his operation, said to Steve that we're not going there. So is it worse than you remember in terms of any inkling that we have or you have that attacks from the Romney campaign are trying to create any racist or racial friction?
I think, well, this election, it doesn't seem that there's a hugely racial component to the message coming out of either campaign. To me, it seemed like the 2008 campaign was more there was a higher racial component to it. But in terms of, I just kind of want to address Ian's question really fast. In terms of like what the half truths and the lies that politicians may or may not be saying, I think, well, first of all, so I guess First Amendment the constitutional First Amendment, political speech is widely protected. There's a lot of stuff you can say in politics that you can't say out in regular discourse. And so politicians as well as special interests alike take advantage of that, and they make a broad amount of statements that are taken out of context. There's a lot of half-truths, there's a lot of things that that just aren't true, but because there's no mechanism for stopping that kind of speech, and because the mechanism that exists protects it, it goes on. And so it's up to regular citizens to do their homework and do their own fact checking. Is it right? Is it morally reprehensible? It's morally reprehensible, absolutely, and it's not right, but it's protected speech, unfortunately.
Could you speak to the question about the racial element though too?
Right, but before that, Ian, you mentioned lies. You really have to ask yourself since there is a gap, there's a natural gap there. Are you talking about the people who don't want to hear a lie, or people that are comforted and welcome the lie, so they could, use that to gain more passion about it, whether it's for or against, or whether it's to pit people against each other, or whatever it may be? And just as he said before, how do you know when they're lying? That's up to the people. The media is always going to be biased. There is always be some lie. History is not one perspective. It's always someone's perspective of history. It's always someone's perspective of the truth. So it's up to the people to do their part to figure out what is a lie, what is real. And sure, there are some things you can't figure out, and you just have to have faith that our leaders are telling us the truth. But that's where we get into the part of the people who see it, who see voting and citizenship and all that as a privilege, or that it's a natural right they deserve and can disregard if they choose.
Before you weigh in on this, I want to just ask a slightly loaded question, but I think it's important. Do you think in this context, because we haven't really discussed it, one of my theories is that it's less trendy to vote in this election, and because you're not really accomplishing a historic thing. And I think young people felt empowered in 2008 that they had an opportunity, and I think in many cases their own views collided well with this. They had an opportunity to elect the first African-American president. And I think that was some of the impetus driving what became sort of a let me take this into my hands approach. And whether or not the Romney administration, or Romney campaign, is, and some of you don't want that, so I won't say that mistruth, but Sana, how do you respond to that question or thought that young people felt like in 2008 they could really have more of a direct historic function in proving once and for all we're not the same slaveholding nation we once were?
There was a lovely exit poll done on the day of the election in 2008. Gallup interviewed every voter who left, or every voter that left the voting booth, and they asked them who they voted for. And an astounding majority voted for Obama, more than the actual percentage of people who voted for Obama. So I think the historicity was sort of inflated. And there's been a shift from the excitement and the hope and the historic game-changing moment of 2008. And there's been a shift to highly, highly polarized discourse. And as the discourse isn't so much focused about pitting race versus race, I think, as it is class. And it's the Democrats are trying to pit the lower and middle class against the upper class, and the Republicans are trying to pit the middle class and the upper class against the lower class. And that is what is fueling some of the most provocative and outrageous statements of the campaign so far, is not so much focused on race, but those moochers, or those 1%ers. It's based on the sort of polarization, and each campaign is trying to capture the middle portion, which is the middle class.
You said trendy. Let's make it clear that politics and elections should be respected and not put in the same category as fashion and everything else. There shouldn't be any popular trend, like I said before, just because it's the first black president or anything else that we should be inclined to say you voted for him or anything else. And speaking as someone who turned 18 a couple of weeks, or roughly nearly a month after the election, and really wanted to vote in in that 2008 election, I didn't see it as we're missing opportunity to vote for the first black president. It's not something. It's not something that you hold on to like that. I just saw it as I was 18 and I was politically inclined and I really wanted to vote. Simple as that.
Whether the Gallup figures support it or not, I think that's always something that's in the back of young people's minds. I mean, the trendy is not my word. Trendy is the word that a student at Union College used to describe his classmates, because he was eligible to vote and he voted in 2008 and he was in high school at the time, and he said to me, and you can read about this in the second article in this series on young voters, but he said to me that his classmates with the bumper stickers or the backpack stickers, the t-shirts, or the chia pets, they know nothing about what's going on now. They know nothing about the 2 years we've had of debt and passes. They know nothing about, now this is his experience, and this lively discussion is really, does not parallel his experience whatsoever, which is actually, I think, a positive thing in terms of youth engagement and civic intervention and this important facet of the electoral landscape. But he said, and several students around him agreed, that it was fashionable. I mean, this is his word. So don't get me wrong. I think that there's a dutiful element of this as a citizen of a democracy that could never be overstated. But young people are very in the moment, and whether it's via the social media that they participate in or anything else they do, and the presidential campaign of the last cycle dominated not really only the political channels through which most non-20-somethings get their information, but also ESPN, with the bracketology. I mean, the president, I think this was actually after he was elected, but he was so involved in that effort to court the young voters on Jon Stewart or Jay Leno or any of the television programs. He may be on the comedians' couches again, and he has been, but there was an element of according to this student, and this is actually, the tenor of this discussion is substantially different from that of other conversations that I've had with young voters, and there have been, okay, you want to interject?
Yeah, sure. So you said, I understand what you mean about trendy now, and it's true. I admit, 4 years ago I was a lot more active than I am now, but a lot has changed in that time. 4 years ago we weren't, personally speaking, I didn't have as many responsibilities now, and I remember coming home or even in school watching every debate, every speech live. And now it's different. I asked my parents or my brother to DVR the speech, but times have changed for each person individually. We're older, we each have jobs. I work 8 hours a day, then go to class, and then have research, and by the time I get home, I only have 3 hours of sleep. So I choose to do my homework and watch the debate over the weekend instead. But that doesn't mean we're less politically responsible, or we're not as involved in things anymore. But I do agree that a lot of people like to say they are politically involved or they're knowledgeable about certain things when they just aren't, because they don't want to feel left out, and that's a bit sad.
I think whether it's trendy, fashionable, in vogue, or popular, I mean, anytime that politics gets into the stream of consciousness of young people, I think that's a good thing. Because to me, it doesn't matter how young people get involved in politics, as long as they get involved in politics. Because the first step in getting young people to kind of get into the political arena is just exposure. And if they're exposed to it, at least they'll know something about it, and then they can, if they do decide to vote, which is the hope, then they can at least make some sort of informed decision, rather than not even hearing about it, just focusing on American Idol or whatever it is that they're most interested in. So I think anytime that politics gets into young people's minds, that's a good thing.
I think the point is they should be exposed to those ideas and everything in the proper way, with as little bias as possible. And that's something that we need to fix as well.
But you can't prevent bias because every family has its own political history, and usually growing up, you know exactly how your parents are going to vote on certain things because they're so vocal about it. And most people tend to stay in line with what their parents believe.
It's a lot easier, but what I meant is be open-minded, and that's what we need to do that's what we need to teach the younger population, our generation, to be very open-minded and listen to what the other person has to say. Judgment, that's another thing entirely. It's like the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover. You can judge as much as you want, but just listen first. Figure out what it is everyone else is doing. Yes.
Are there any other questions? Thoughts? do you guys have any more comments? Is there an area of this youth bloc or an area of this election that we haven't emphasized enough?
I think in terms of like the youth vote is critical to expand, and I think that the more we do as individuals, it kind of rubs off, it has a multiplier effect. If you do something, then your friends on Facebook will see that, and then maybe they won't be gung-ho about it, but at least they'll know about it, and just kind of snowballs from that. Politics, for young people, is kind of like a group thing. People don't do it individually, they do it as groups. And so, the bigger movement you can grow and be a part of, the more you can accumulate in terms of people. And that's a good thing, in my opinion, getting young people out there.
I think it's interesting when you talk to young people, when I talk to my peers about the presidency and politics and all those things. And it's actually one big part of the presidency we didn't talk about at all today. We didn't talk about foreign policy. I think young people are very insular and very one-minded, and actually this probably goes for most Americans. They're very focused on what goes on at home while not realizing the huge role the U.S. takes on abroad, and that makes certain policy decisions easier for presidents who have the benefit of an unattentive public who is focused more on job numbers or paying their bills and what's going on around the world.
And that brings up a very interesting point. It's not just to see what American citizens and anyone in this country thinks of our political system, who should be our leaders, but what about people outside this country? What about people in other countries, other people our age? What are they thinking when it comes to seeing this election? When you look at other elections in other countries, speaking personally, I'm Indian, so when I look at Indian election, that has in the past, it hasn't really come up that much as something I would immediately take time out of my day for this moment to check on it or read about over the weekend. But if you look at the lives of younger people, our generation in other countries, they see American elections as a really big thing because it affects everyone in this world. America is, I don't want to go as far as saying it's the heart of everything else, but it certainly does connect a lot of other countries together and holds the balance and sometimes starts some fights, and it's very much so like a sibling rivalry there.
Well, with that, if there are no other questions, thank you for coming, and I think we'll be happy to discuss this further if any of you have questions that you want to just talk about with us outside of this panel. But thanks very much for being here, and I hope you found it interesting.